Welcome to a new episode of Future Framed TV, the collective podcast of Traces and Dreams. I am Connie Nshemereirwe and I am the host of the podcast A is Not for Apple. This is a series exploring the extent to which our education systems reflect our lived experiences as Africans and how in turn we can transform that education to help us more fruitfully engage with the challenges and inconsistencies that we see in our reality. My guest today is Dr. Divine Fuh, who is the director of the Institute for Humanities in Africa at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. Welcome, Divine.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation, Connie.
Right. Divine is a social anthropologist, which means he studies human societies and cultures and their development. And his research focuses on the ways that we continue to smile, even in the midst of suffering. Most recently, he addresses questions around how young people, especially those in urban centers, adapt to the challenging situations that cities present, and how these young people end up maintaining an active attitude despite the permanent difficulties of finding a place in a society that doesn't appear to have a place for them. I think this is super interesting work, Divine, and I really look forward to diving in. But before we do that, I always ask my guests one question, and that is, when you hear the phrase, A is not for apple, what comes to mind?
Guavas and mangoes.
All right.
So not many
apple.
other things. No, not
right.
apples, because apple comes from a particular context with a particular history. And when I grew up, I dreamt about apples. I imagined apples. And when I met apples, it took me some time to acquire the taste. But guavas and mangoes are things that I grew up with. And every time I hear apple, I think about Newton and his question, somebody who was sitting in his context and had an apple fall on his head and asked the question, why does this apple fall? So we are asking the same questions, but we live with guavas. So I think about guavas because I want to understand why guavas fall on my head.
There you go. I must admit, I did learn I started my alphabet with A's for apple. I don't know how you started your alphabet, but I only saw an apple in real life when I was around 15, 16, because they don't grow here in Uganda. They are now being grown in some parts of the country, which can sustain them. But for me too, it was just something that I saw on the television or in books and just was not part of my reality. So, and in exploring how our education systems reflect our lived realities, this for me, I thought was an apt title for a podcast. And I'm glad to see that you two have a similar disorientation around A being so central, or rather apple being so central to our education systems.
Yeah. We had so many things like axes, but apple was quite central. And I never understood until when I traveled to Europe. Then I understood like what an apple is and what an apple tree looks like and why it's so important in the lives of Europeans. But it's mangoes
and European children in particular, so that their education might start with this.
Yes, because you need apples to survive. I mean, in Europe without apples, there is no Europe without apples because farmers' lives are on apples. You need an apple to eat every day. You need an apple for lunch, for dinner, to make apple tarts and many other things. But, we don't make apple tarts. It was guavas that we ate every day and mangoes because guavas was everywhere in every compound. At least in some other places, it's avocados, or pears. We called it pears, not avocados,
Yeah.
So you're right. It's one of those things that demonstrates the ways in which our education, our thinking, the concepts that we use to make meaning of our everyday lives actually external to the very places in which we are located. So this podcast is, and its title and its objectives are just well framed. Yeah.
Well, no, I not to mention that the apple keeps the doctor away. You were saying all the things that the apple is essential to in the child of a European child. What I'm also curious about then is to tell us a little bit about your own education journey and how you came to social anthropology and to the research that you do. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was an accident, but in a way, getting into social anthropology, I think, was already written into my DNA. I must have been born an anthropologist. I think we are all, if we take anthropology as a study of social relations and also the study of the way of encounters, and just trying to understand the process by which we come to make and maintain the human, then it is something that really underpins our everyday and ordinary lives. And especially if you come from an African context, you're a person who is constantly embedded in relationships and always asking questions about those relationships and also challenged by these relationships. I studied I grew up in a small a village. I grew up in a small village where there was no electricity, and I recall there was a British woman who used to walk across the town bare feet, and I didn't understand, because I used to ask my mother, why in the midst of this context we try to get shoes and we walk bare feet and places are so hot. Why is this woman walking bare feet? And my mother, I think, used to say then that, oh, don't worry, these people are crazy. But it's an anthropologist. She's here just to understand people and to live like us. And I also used to just understand why would you do such a thing, so I studied there in primary school. It's a place called Fundong, a small village. After that, I went to GHS Womb for high school, because my parents were teachers and also farmers, and they moved around the country. Then after that, I was very interested in literature, questions of literature, Chinua Achebe. I read T.S. Eliot. I read French literature, English literature across the African continent, because I think Pan-Africanism was very big at that time, and the education system wanted to build an African who would be assertive and to rethink the continent and the future, but at the same time, someone who was well grounded in material across the continent. So I was attracted to literature and to history. And in high school, I did letters, English, literature, French, and history. It's a place called Cast Bambili. After that, I went to the University of Buea in Cameroon, where I did my bachelor's degree. And I enrolled for journalism and mass communication. And then I did political science and also drama and theater arts. And in the course of my work at the University of Buea, I was hired as a research assistant with two professors, Dr. Eno Tanjong and Josh Gua, heads of departments, and they took me under their wings. And they used to ask me to do research work for them, to do lots of reading, to help them write their paper, their abstracts or drafts, and do a little bit of research. Then I got to work then with a German researcher as a research assistant to do ethnographic field work in the Cameroon, one of the Cameroon national parks called the Korop National Parks, one of the oldest rainforests. And that was my earlier introductions to ethnographic work. And then I got so interested in this question of development that I then moved to Botswana, the University of Botswana, where I undertook an MA in development studies. And in the course of that, I was a teaching assistant to an anthropologist, the only anthropologist then in the department, Triasa Galvin from Ireland, who encouraged me and pushed me, to study anthropology. And then I woke up one morning and got an email from a professor in Basel that I had been recommended by another professor, Francis Nyamjo, for a fellowship. And then I found myself at the University of Basel, and I wanted to extend the work that I had started in Botswana, because I arrived in Botswana in the middle of HIV, and I did work on youth and sexual expression. And then at the University of Basel, I extended that work to continue working with youth, but to focus on questions of masculinity and young people in the city. And since then, I have fallen in love with anthropology, and I wouldn't give it up for anything.
Well, firstly, I am so envious that you lived in the city of Basel. It's similar to people who live in the city of Barcelona or the city of Delft. There are cities that I have been to that I thought was so picturesque and so breathtaking that I wondered what it was like to live there. But that aside, I also often think there are various studies or professions that I really would have loved to be part of. I would have loved to be a philosopher. I would have loved to be an anthropologist, because I think I find these the studies of how people of society and how we live and why we do the things that we do so interesting. I settled on education, which allows me sometimes to pretend to be a philosopher, or even pretend to be an anthropologist, or pretend to be what I like, because if I read up on it, then I can teach a little bit of it. But I do envy you various things, and it sounds, when you say that you really were a born anthropologist, I'm so glad that you feel that you found the niche for you, the spot for you. And one of the things that really consumes me is the question of how education can enable us to become more fully who we are. And by this, I mean, allow our personality to really shine, allow our natural giftings to be nurtured. In your case, you had these questions about anthropology early on when you saw this woman walking around barefoot, but then you finally landed in anthropology many years later, and kind of by accident, which a happy accident, but you might not have ever. You might be doing something else that, yeah, you could do, but doesn't really fill you with such enthusiasm and motivation. And so the question that I always have is, to what extent do our current education systems, and it seems you've been exposed to a couple, you're now in South Africa, you are in Botswana, you are in Cameroon, you are in Switzerland, and maybe you've done a bit of reading about it. How do you think that our education system facilitates this becoming? And or what are the gaps? Or how does it fail to do so?
Yeah, so education is really core and central to making any people and to making any society. And education, if you look at history, education has occurred in so many different ways, whether through initiation schools, that we had before, whether through particular age groups that we used to have before. So the project of having to create a particular kind of person who engages with a society in a particular way has always been there. And I think that this is something that we have not taken too seriously about our own societies, because when I say we, I'm talking about many of us as African people. We have positioned our minds in a space where we continue to think that the external, and that's what Beninese philosopher Pauline Otenji calls extraversion, that being extraverted is the way of becoming, and that it's the only valuable way of we becoming. So if you don't pass the London GCE, then you're not something. If you don't have a degree from Oxford, then you're not something. If you don't have a degree from the University of Nairobi, if you haven't gone outside the country, then you're not valuable. And I think that's really problematic. And I think that really essential requirements that we need to really think about. Is how to build an education system that responds to national projects that we want to develop. But in order for that to happen, we have to have a national project, because if our project is just development, we have a problem. That's why when I did a master's in development studies, I never wanted to have anything to do with development, because development is a kind of a violation and an interruption of our own growth, of our own progress. Not that it does not have elements that contribute, to our growth, but it's a violence because it is an attempt to try to reproduce and to locate ourselves in a global community where we continuously find it difficult to find meaning and voice. So our education systems need to do what you asked me before, the apple, to ask the question about the apple. This guy sat under a tree and asked, why does this apple fall on my head? And he was sitting in that space, and it was an important question that he asked. Why is this apple falling under my head? So if we're sitting under a guava tree, we have to ask the same question. Why is the guava tree falling under my head? We cannot sit under a guava tree and ask, why is an apple falling on my head? And that's the issue with our education system. We are spending so much time asking about why apples are falling on our head, instead of asking why guavas are falling on our heads. So we have to start by thinking about a national project or a continental project that is driven towards building a particular kind of individual, a particular kind of person. That's the first. We don't know who we are training. We are so invested in training entrepreneurs and training all of these other people to be part of a global community, but disconnected from their own people. So we have, like, why is it that you go to a country where we have lots of old age and aging issues? There are lots of people who are aging. We are not invested in aging, but we spend so much time investing in training people, stuff that will not help those old people, And that's what I call, that's your apple question and your guava question. Our education systems must ensure that we build programs, curriculum, courses that actually respond to our everyday needs, and through that contribute to the global community.
Yeah. No, I really do hear what you're saying, especially about the extraversion. And recently I was listening to the radio, and there is a new campaign about, I think the European Union is the #1 promoter of getting rid of the death penalty, and we as Ugandans, this and the other. An agenda like that is fine, but then you hear all sorts of things on, being promoted strongly that are external, that do not emerge from appreciating the challenges that we face. I don't know if our biggest problem is the death penalty, or whatever other issues that the whole country is always getting behind. And it could indeed stem from the fact that the questions that we ask, are preformed. We don't ask, the questions don't come from us. It's not something that really comes out of our wondering about our experience. It's questions that are preset, the questions that you should ask, or the questions that one asks, rather than the questions that you come up with, that things that you wonder about. As you were speaking about a guava falling on the head, I thought perhaps this wouldn't be the question that someone might ask about the guava. They might ask, why does the guava have such when you're eating it, why are the seeds so hard, or what, some other question. So I really recognize what you're saying. And in thinking about, when I asked you about how you think our education systems could respond more appropriately, you talked about the notion of introversion. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so the education system that we have is born out of a certain context. I think it's always important to go go back. So it's not that it's bad. I think every time you critique this, there are lots of criticism that you're trying to say that this is not useful. It's not that it's bad. It's actually great, but it is meant for a particular purpose. We came out of independence, and it was important to train a group of people who will be able to carry on with a post-colonial state. And you can see that training people in grammar, training technicians, training people, engineers and others who could actually assist the colonial state to continue with the project of imperialism was important, and it has done its job, it's done its purpose. So what we need is to rethink. There was a time post-independence when lots of states were trying to build a unitary state, and there was an investment in many of those countries to put in place programs that will build national identities, to make people to identify themselves as people from a particular place, also because of the diversity. That was an attempt to intervene, to build a society that responded, to a particular need at that time, which was to unify a people. So what we need to do is to ensure that we do not have an education system which is really meant to make us be part of a global community, or to make us to serve global needs. We have to ensure that we have an education system that serves our needs, so that we are able to serve the global community. And that is in simple terms, that is introversion. That we should be asking the questions that you are asking. That is not necessarily about gravity. Question could be about something else, and for me, the simple, one of the easiest examples is just the fact that we have aging is a serious issue on this continent. But I don't see an investment across the curriculum, across the continent, to really investigate and find solutions to aging. You have a lot of young people who are leaving their parents' home, scattered around the world, and we don't know what is going to happen to elderly people.
Yeah.
Investing in that and asking questions about that, and looking for solutions to deal with it. That is intervention. Asking questions that are relevant to us rather than relevant, to the global community. Yeah.
Right. So I'm also concerned about the fact that, as you say, there are very many issues that really affect us that no one is asking questions about, and aging being one of them. And I wonder, as we go forward, another fact about our population is that it's growing at a very high rate, and we expect to double in population, I think, in 30 or 40 years. And so there's going to be a lot of children being born, or that are being born now. And I wonder how you think the education system can prepare us to ask better questions, because some of these questions that you are talking about are questions that may be asked by a full-grown adult, you might say, maybe not a child, but maybe a child could also ask such questions. And in Uganda, we have all sorts of curriculum review, curriculum reform, this and the other, but usually the content doesn't change. And so maybe you have approaches, or some content goes away, but there's always that core content, as you said, that content that people feel is really important and is what education is. It's like a static thing that is, again, one of those external validation to say, how can you have an education where you don't study ABC? This is what proper education is. And I wonder what the opportunities are for these millions of children that are going to be born in the next couple of decades, in preparing them to ask the questions that need to be asked. Do you see any opportunities? Or?
Yeah, I think every generation has its own challenges, and it also inherits challenges from others. And every generation develops its own strategies and also inherits strategies from others. Something that we learn by being parents is that it doesn't matter what you tell your kids, they are going to do what they want to do, and they will always think that you don't understand. until after they've become adults, then they actually turn back to you and start celebrating you again and worshiping all of the stuff that you have done, to them. So what we can actually do is to first train this generation to accept who they are, to be assertive about who they are, and also where they come from, because that assertiveness is very important for having to take their context seriously. So when you train people to continuously apologize for who they are and where they come from, it means that you're orienting them towards going elsewhere. And that's what we've done over the past years, that everything is a problem. You talk about child upbringing, we say it's a problem. You talk about eating, we say it's a problem. You talk about walking, is a problem. About laughing, is a problem. So we have to get to a point where we first help people to understand who we are and to accept who we are. That will be the first step in an education system, and also to understand what it is to become and what it is to be part of a society of collective people with diverse people and with diverse different beliefs. That's really important. So people understand the diversity of beliefs, but also to train them to understand that diversity is not a problem, it's a strength. Because right now, we have actually built an education system which is oriented towards disintegrating or detonating diversity, because we want to be one language. Like everyone will ask you, what's your official language? You come from a place like Cameroon with over 280 languages, everybody wants an official language, So training people to understand that diversity is important and diversity is not destructive is also very key. And then building an education system that invests in training respectful people is really key. People who see other humans. So that should be a foundation for young people, because part of the challenge that we have today is that people don't see you. If you're a woman, you're a problem. If you are a gay person, you are a problem. If you're a Muslim, you're a problem. If you're a fundamentalist, you're a problem. So we are trained to undervalue every other person who is different and does not conform to who we are. So to build a better society where we are actually assertive and accepting of all we have and work collectively to be a more prosperous society, we actually first have to value everyone and every contribution. And that should be the bedrock of the foundations of our education system.
Yeah.
Once you've done that, it is easy to begin to train people to understand. If you're Buganda or Baganda, we understand what is it to be a Buganda person, and what is it to grow in this context? What is it to contribute in this context as someone from this place? And being someone from that place does not mean that somebody who comes from the next village is less valuable than you are. So what are the things that connect us all, and where are we moving to? And I think that would be, once we do that, we are going to revolutionize the world and also force the world to turn to us, to begin to try to understand us and accept us for who we are.
Yeah. So it's interesting that you say that we first of all need to know who we are. It's a very difficult situation where we have lost touch with who we are, really. But I suppose it can start with asking questions, just reflecting and speaking with one another and reflecting, I suppose, introverting, as you say. And at the same time, I find that when you know who you are, the tendency sometimes is to think you're better than others. So it's also important, as you say, to still know that others are of value and they are who they are, and to appreciate who they are and understand that, as you say, diversity is strength, because who they are and who you are as a whole is greater than the parts, as they say. And it's interesting also to me. I think the question that came to me as you were speaking was, we can build this kind of education system for the young people, but I wonder, you mentioned parents at one point. This weekend I was visiting with an uncle and aunt of mine, My uncle has grown up in a rural setting. He speaks his native language very well. His wife speaks the same native language. They're both pretty in touch with their culture, but their children don't speak a word of their native language. And it's something that really shocked me because they were the last people that I expected. They're not even people like me who grew up in the city and had to sort of learn my local language by listening to my parents. But it's a language that they were surrounded by. And now that they have their own children, it's not even something that is that they do consciously. I don't know if I don't know what it's not that, as you say, I think our brains, through our education system, unconsciously value this external. We speaking English is an improvement or is progress. And so if the two of you are educated and speak English and have children, you won't question continuing to speak to your children in English. It's not even something that if you were to stop and think about it, that you would prefer, but it's just something that you're almost conditioned to do. And so I wonder if there isn't also a project that needs us adults, the parents, to appreciate, I don't know, to reflect on what we are now, and also think about what we prefer to become, but the thing that we are not even working on. If you ask, I think, my uncle what he prefers, he'll tell you, no, I prefer my children to be in touch with their ancestral people and the language and the beliefs and the history and the culture, and also thrive in modern society. But he has unconsciously cut off one, which, though, if he was to stop and think, is something that he prefers. So I wonder if it's also not a matter of having a project to bring us adults to this consciousness.
Yeah, in a way. I mean, let me say several things. I think that we as Africans, I think Francis Nyamjo calls it, we are incomplete people. So our lives is always to complete ourselves through others, that we are because of others, and it's something across the world, that the world is so intertwined that people cannot live without other people. I mean, Switzerland is the highest, one of the highest producers of chocolate in the world. But what would Switzerland be without Cote d'Ivoire? Without people growing cocoa in Cote d'Ivoire. So one is that we are intertwined, and we are always enriching ourselves through encounters. And if you look at what we call tradition today, what we call tradition and culture in the African context is a history of borrowing and enriching it with lots and lots of other practices as we meet people and we encounter people. So it is important to acknowledge and celebrate that and not take it as a problem. And then the second is that is to look at the work that lots of feminists have been pushing. That feminism is especially, in my view, about building a more dignified society and a more respectable society, and a place where we value people better, a more caring space, and that should drive us. That should be, for me, it's no point speaking a local language if you are a horrible human being. If you're speaking your language and you end up beating your wife and beating every other people, I'm sorry, you're a horrible human. If you are able to dance your cultural dance and eat your food and prepare it, and at the same time you're abusive to children, sorry, you're a horrible human being. At the center of our training should be having to build respectful people and dignified people. That should be at the core, because once we do that, society changes, and parents have a very important role in this. Because the home is the core. If every parent, for example, was able to invest in building respectful children, the world would be different. If you went out and every kid you pass on the street told you good morning sister, good morning uncle, good morning grandmother, it will be very different. If you're going to have a world in which adults will be able to see each other and stand and ask good morning even when they don't know them, and ask them what their day is like. If you had a world in which parents had trained children to say thank you for everything, you're going to have a world in which people are appreciated better. You know, if you had a world in which parents, every time a child was laughing and mocking at another child, even when it's playfulness, to explain to them that laughing at this child is a problem, laughing at this other one is a problem, we're going to have a completely different tomorrow, where now speaking your language will make sense, where eating your food will make sense, because at the core and the center of it will be respect for the human and respect for each person. And I think on this continent, that is what Africa should drive. That is what Africa should be contributing to the world, to build a better human being, because the development and modernity that we have inherited is a modernity of exclusion. It's a modernity of violence. It's a modernity of competition and comparison. It's a modernity of abuse, domination. It's a modernity where if a person, you're living in Uganda, you see someone who comes from Kenya as somebody who should not be breathing the same oxygen in your place. You know, where if you're in Cote d'Ivoire, you think that the person who is coming from Cameroon should not be eating your same food or having right to health. Where if you're in South Africa, you think that all of these people speak a language called Kwere Kwere and therefore should not have right to that space. We have invested in an education system whose sole purpose is to train disrespectful people. And that's our problem.
Yeah, I have to agree. And I think a very good example or demonstration of this is the division between educated and uneducated even. I mean, the person who's uneducated is less than human. I mean, has nothing to say, value, cannot really contribute. And it's just a second-class citizen. So the values of respect, as you say, and inclusion are, I mean, I have to agree as I listen to you, really foundational to raising a society that will be good for everyone. I mean, I cannot imagine that you would harm somebody that you're saying good morning to and smiling to as you pass. It's hard to then turn around and think of them as less than you are. I wish I had time to ask about all the research that you do with urban youth, because obviously education must play a very big part, or their access to formal education or the homes that they grow up in or the way they are formed certainly plays a huge part in how they adapt to the life that they have to adapt to, given all the external challenges, the global economy, you talk about the failure of the state and things like this. But I would like you to put on that lens and then think for the many in Uganda, we have a lot of children who have dropped out of school, and so they are considered uneducated, and yet they have to make a living. They have to find some kind of dignified way of being, and many of them are in the cities. And I wonder how you would close on thinking, if you were to do one thing tomorrow to tackle this big issue, what would you do? What would be your first thing?
Wow, the first thing would be to close all schools. To close all schools, and because it's the responses to what you say, because I think formal education is overrated.
I have to agree. I'm afraid.
The formal education as it is now is overrated. So it's important that when I say close all school, that it is not misconstrued that I'm saying we shouldn't go to school, but just to pause for a while and to reflect, because you say that there are lots of people on the streets who are uneducated, because we've built a system that undervalues that labor. The fact that they are on the street doesn't mean that they are not doing valuable work. You know, when you park your car and you come back and nothing happens to it, who was looking at that? Who was watching that car? Who was valuing that car? People who live in particular spaces understand you going and coming and you and going, and they have skills on how to be on the street, how to clean the street, how to do stuff on the street that you don't know. You have lots of people who are not in school, who are taking care of elderly parents, who are taking care of uncles, who are taking care of fields and farms, but those are not valued. And that's what building a society which values human changes. Because why is it that you have elites who grow up, and in our societies you have a maid, or somebody calls it domestic, or somebody who is a house helper, and you're paying that person 50 cents for waking up in the morning, cleaning your house, preparing food, going to the farm, doing lots of other stuff for you all day non-stop. But all you've done is gone and sat in front of a computer, and you're paid like 1 billion times more than the person who was doing that work. And you actually think that you have more value to society. After COVID-19, I have said that if during COVID and during the lockdown, you were not classified as an essential service, you should think again. Think again about your value. And on this continent, COVID should teach us that more than 99% of all of the professions that we had, the trades and stuff that we did, could not help people during COVID-19. And we were all locked down.
Yeah.
You know, why is it that we're still investing in training people in the military for basic, as they say, they call it essential service or national service? You know, why are we still doing all of this stuff? We should be focusing on the things that really make us people in this society, which is care, being nurses, valuing people, health, caring for other stuff. And that's why I would close all universities, close all high schools and all secondary schools, just to give us a month or two to reflect and see what happens to society when we close all of those. And we see that people have been finding ways to continue. Children at home getting to learn to know their parents better, parents getting to learn to know their kids better, people missing people that they hated for so long, but understanding what they appreciate about those people. That is the world that we should be building going on. Lock down everyone, close down, and then rethink and relaunch.
I couldn't agree more. And I think, unfortunately, therefore, we've kind of wasted the opportunity that the COVID-19 pandemic has offered us, because here in Uganda, we are still scrambling to distribute the content. We are still scrambling to try and keep things as normal as possible, instead of taking the opportunity to just say, okay, something appears to be wrong. And during lockdown, I know as a teacher, I'm glad to say I was considered essential, but still, I was not allowed to go out on the streets. The only people who were allowed to go out on the streets and that I found in the end were so essential were people who sold food. If in the city, the person who sells food, if you can't reach them, or if they can't reach you, you're going to starve because you don't grow your own food, and you can't enter your car and drive to a farm someplace and buy the food. And yet, as you say, they're the people that we think are among the least valuable people. And so, and again, if we were in the mental space to look around and ask these questions and say, wait, all right, so I'm not an essential worker. What does that mean? And who are the essential workers? And what does that mean? How can we respond? Sure. Rather than how fast can we go back to how things were and just carry on? So I really hear what you're saying. All right, so your advice is to close all schools. I like that.
For a moment, to close them.
For a moment, just to pause.
Exactly.
Just to pause. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being my guest on this episode of A is Not for Apple, and for sharing your thoughts on how we can be more introverted, how we can get back to trying to discover who we are and value who we are and accept who we are, but also to value what everyone else brings in their differences, and how diversity can make us so much stronger. And also just to say that it's not too late, I guess. It will take a lot of courage, I think, for us to just say, look, you guys, let's stop and forget about all the things that we value I guess, all these things that are external to us, and really define our own value, define the things that we ought to be valuing, and for once lead the world. Because you said earlier that if we can understand that a society built on respect, who accept themselves and know themselves and also appreciate others, that we really could be an example to the world that does the opposite, that says we should compete and these people should be less than us and so on. So I really think it's a great vision of the way that we could be in the world. So thanks a lot, Divine, and maybe speak to you again soon.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you very much.